Last week, on Chapter 3 of this season of the podcast, we discussed the big changes for Mystery Science Theater 3000's second season, the troubled origins of comedy on cable, and the licensing issues that led to a tape-sharing movement. This time we're going to discuss the birth of Comedy Central, the origins of Pushing the Button, the ups and downs of Season 3, and how the show heavily benefited from two film distributors, one who played by the rules, and one who is still wanted by the feds. I'm Ryan Rodriguez, and this is Season 1 of The Coolness Chronicles, the history and legacy of MST3K. Chapter 4, The Japanese Season. Season 2, airing on the Comedy Channel, concluded in February of 1991. Within 2 months, the channel would be no more. Time Warner, which owned the Comedy Channel, and Viacom, which owned the competing network Ha, decided to merge in April of 1991, becoming CTV, the Comedy Network. During this period, most of the original programming airing on the Comedy Channel was jettisoned. But, despite how it sounds, this was the best possible thing to happen to MST3K. The lack of other non-syndicated programming made the show much more valuable to the network. So valuable, in fact, that instead of considering another 13-episode season, a contract was set for 3 seasons consisting of 24 episodes each. So when did MST3K begin its run on CTV? Well, it didn't. CTV, the Comedy Network, began broadcasting on April 1st, but due to legal issues stemming from the previous existence of another channel with the same name, lasted way too briefly. Canada's CTV, which is essentially ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, and the CW all rolled into one, had already held the name for 30 years at that point, so the American CTV lasted exactly 2 months, relaunching yet again on June 1st with the permanent name Comedy Central. One of the few shows to launch on this first broadcast day, the season premiere of MST3K. Having a new network meant having new management, and thankfully the Comedy Central management treasured their prize program. Hell, ordering 72 episodes is quite extravagant, as associate producer and co-star Kevin Murphy put it in the episode guide.
Boy, were we in the money. This meant that I no longer had to share an office with Trace, we could afford to keep Soda Pop in the fridge, and we could afford to buy a fridge to put Soda Pop in. Mike Nelson got an office, well, not really an office, but he got to work out of the makeup room, which was actually a closet where the phone switching equipment was installed. As far as we were concerned, this was the lap of luxury. Man, we had it made.
Also, additional funds meant a larger crew, starting with the writer's room. Head writer Mike Nelson helped hire 2 local comedians, Paul Chaplin, possibly the most academic and studied member of the staff, and the lovely and brilliant Bridget Jones, who also happened to be Mike's fiancée, now wife. Both Paul and Bridget would remain with the show until its second cancellation in 1999, with Paul also returning for the Netflix revival. Paul and Bridget would also appear on the show throughout the years as numerous characters, Paul most memorably as a demon named Pitch, and Bridget delivering an uncanny impersonation of magical pixie Mr. B. Natural, who we'll discuss later in this chapter. A bigger writing staff meant more variety in terms of riffing expertise, but more importantly, it allowed for there to be a sufficient staff to handle scripting duties when Best Brains architects, Joel Hodgson, Jim Mallon, Trace Beaulieu, and the aforementioned Kevin Murphy, were dealing with corporate shenanigans and had to travel for days at a time. Whereas in the past, the entire crew would have to scramble and hastily put together an episode in case the suits came calling, from this point on, a skeleton crew was always available. In some cases, the writing of entire episodes were handled primarily by this new backup team, which would soon include Mary Jo Pehl, and their efforts were so perfect that even most hardcore fans wouldn't even notice the difference unless they were told. But we'll touch on these instances in time. The network also started to consult with the crew when it came to promoting the show, and in doing so, helped form an annual tradition that continues to this day, Turkey Day, a 30-hour marathon of hand-picked episodes from the staff, with bumpers and interstitials along the way. We'll discuss this event towards the end of the episode, so if you don't give a shit about anything else in Season 3, you can now skip to the end. Or you could just keep listening.
You'll have to decide. You'll have to decide. You'll have to decide.
For the next few chapters of this season of the podcast, we have so many episodes to get through that I'm going to skip around a bit chronologically. I'll cover everything, but in the interest of discussing the whole picture and not boring you, it's essential to be relatively nonlinear. The third season premiere was the terminally predictable and insultingly ludicrous Conan the Barbarian ripoff Cave Dwellers, starring good sport Miles O'Keefe. The episode was the second to utilize the library of disgraced releasing company Film Ventures International, but it was certainly not the last. The FBI library is one that will live in infamy, but in order to truly explain why, we need to pause the narrative and travel back in time to the year 1968. There, we will meet a shady producer who makes the financiers of Cannon Films look like Boy Scouts, a man named Edward L. Montoro. Edward L. Montoro was an Atlanta-based movie producer who formed his own distribution company, Film Ventures International, in 1968. The first movie from the company was the Montoro-directed softcore porno Getting Into Heaven, which grossed 20 times its $13,000 budget and allowed Montoro to expand his empire greatly and quickly. When he wasn't distributing cheap Italian knockoffs of the latest American crowd pleaser, he was producing his own American knockoffs of the latest American crowd pleasers. This naturally led the company into frequent legal trouble, always with good cause. Their first big acquisition was 1974's Beyond the Door, a delightful little romantic drama about the complex class system in Italy. Oh, who the hell am I kidding? It was a shameless cash-in on Warner Brothers' 1973 classic The Exorcist. FBI acquired the domestic distribution of the movie for $100,000 and reaped around $15 million for their efforts. Naturally, Warner Brothers sued, claiming copyright infringement, and ended up receiving a cash settlement and a portion of future profits. Luckily for FBI, this lawsuit was directed at the Italian production company, so a bullet was seemingly dodged. Their next ripoff was domestically based and probably avoided legal entanglement out of pity. In 1976, FBI capitalized on the American movie-going public going bonkers over Jaws a year earlier, with Montoro financing a ripoff that took the basic plot, monstrous, unstoppable animal goes on a bloody rampage in a small community, and recast the animal. I know what's going through your mind right now. What would be the most logical monster to replace a great white shark? A killer whale? No, that's orca. A squid? That was probably 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Lamprey eels? I'm pretty sure Sci-Fi and the Asylum have one of those already. No, this movie decided to take an aquatic-based monster movie and move it into a more terra firma setting, a woodland national park, and the beast going around tearing people to shreds? One pissed-off grizzly bear. Grizzly ended up taking a production budget of $750,000 and turned it inexplicably into the highest-grossing independent film of all time, with a gross of $39 million. Thankfully, the record was beaten 2 years later by John Carpenter's Halloween, which we'll discuss in a future episode, and most people never heard of Grizzly again. Trying to mention every way that Grizzly contorted and putrefied the basic story details of Jaws would take at least an hour, but the movie does end with a grizzly bear taking down a helicopter in flight and a park ranger blowing it up with a bazooka, so it's not entirely without merit. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I give Grizzly a wholehearted recommendation with a caveat. If you were to purchase the film from RiffTrax, where it was released in the summer of 2017, you will have spent $10 wisely. If you were to go to Amazon and purchase the Blu-ray, I would feel compelled to strangle you while screaming about the injustice of all the films of actual quality that are unavailable in the format, like Joe Dante's Explorers, another not-so-good ripoff of a Spielberg blockbuster, E.T. in this case, that still makes Grizzly look like an even more miserable piece of shit. But remember that dodged bullet I mentioned a minute or so ago? It turns out that bullet decided to boomerang in 1982 due to a decision that would go back to the well of shamelessly cannibalizing Jaws. The legal trouble with Warner Brothers may have been avoided, but this time, Universal came after FBI, and it was truly the beginning of the end. The Italian exploitation movie circuit has been ripping off the competition for so long that it's practically a national tradition. Unfortunately, the makers of the 1981 movie The Last Shark chose to make a movie so close to Jaws and its 1978 sequel that it plays like an incompetent shot-for-shot remake with none of the charm and a distinct feeling of contempt for the audience it's supposed to be pandering to. Universal, the studio that produced Spielberg's original classic, seemed to have eliminated most public desire for the Jaws franchise in the years since 1975, going so far as to develop a never-produced sequel/parody of the series, National Lampoon's Jaws 3: People Zero, which we'll discuss much later. But despite all this, when FBI distributed The Last Shark under the title Great White in March of 1982, it grossed $18 million in the US alone. Literally a month later, Universal had sued FBI for copyright infringement and won. The movie was instantly pulled from theaters, and all remaining negative prints were immediately remanded to the Universal Vault. A little side note, by 2016, RiffTrax was able to license the film for riffing, and the film has since regained its notoriety in the US. It's also, just like Grizzly, one of the most enjoyable ways to spend $10 if you're so inclined. Around this period, good old Edward Montoro was simply not learning from his failures, producing one god-awful affront to the art of film after the other, and importing some of the most baffling turds Europe had to offer, like Pod People, which we'll get to very soon. In 1984, Film Ventures International was on the verge of collapse due to financial issues, including the poor box office performance of Montoro's final movie, the atrocious Mutant, another RiffTrax title, and his pending divorce settlement. In 1985, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and it was produced by I&I Entertainment Group, a small company that produced product for TV syndication and was looking to trade in on the brand name of Film Ventures International in the shadiest way possible. Beginning in 1987, this new version of FBI got into the legally questionable practice of acquiring the rights to show clips of movies and then using clips which actually consisted of movies almost in their entirety with the quote-unquote FBI treatment, which meant replacing the music, renaming the movie, and inserting new opening credit sequences, then claiming the copyright to those elements. Many of these patchwork movies were subsequently shown on MST3K, primarily in the third season. We'll go through these episodes first, and I'll explain which of the standard FBI elements are utilized and just how egregious each usage is. And what of Montoro? He eventually embezzled $1 million from his FBI bank accounts and vanished, never to be seen again. To this day, Montoro's whereabouts remain unknown, though it is believed that he fled to Mexico in early 1987 under a false name. Nobody even knows for sure if he's still alive, which at least allows me the feeling of hope that one day soon we'll find out that he's definitely dead. So, let's go back to 1991 and finally discuss the Season 3 premiere and one of the best examples of the new FBI bag of tricks, Cave Dwellers. Cave Dwellers is, in actuality, the second installment of an Italian Conan ripoff trilogy about Ator, a character who is not a barbarian because that's infringement. He's an Iron Warrior, or a Fighting Eagle, or a Blade Master. It depends on which of the three movies you're watching. Actually, that's not true. It depends on the title of the movie that you're watching, because those words are never actually used in dialogue, nor are they demonstrated visually, but we're getting into semantics.
It was a time long ago. A force was discovered so great it could destroy the universe. Then the evil of the earth rose up with all their might to seize this force for their own. Nothing stood in their way except one man. The Blade Master.
Going by the original title of Cave Dwellers, Ator is a Blade Master in this film, and by the climax of the movie, in which Ator flies a modern hang glider in barbarian times and begins to drop bombs on his enemy's fortress, it's easy to see why he earned that title. Or not. We also get evil samurai with pointy metal tiaras, cannibals that worship a giant snake, and a plucky Asian sidekick named Thong. Whenever you get the feeling that you're not watching a much dumber Conan movie, just wait about 5 minutes and that feeling will definitely dissipate. To top it all off, the movie ends with stock footage of a nuclear bomb explosion, which, given the 90 minutes of dull misery that you've just waded through, serves as the perfect metaphor for the entire experience. If you're wondering about the pedigree of the talent behind the camera, it's worth noting that the writer-director Joe D'Amato was kind of a reverse Roger Corman. Between 1976 and 1982, he directed at least 3 movies a year, the vast majority being split between horror and Italian pornography. Sometimes he did both at the same time, which is why a movie exists called Porno Holocaust. He also produced Troll 2 and one of my favorite RiffTrax releases, Ghost House. When it comes to D'Amato, you win some and you lose some, and in this situation, win actually translates as lose. For the FBI version of this movie, the opening credits use footage from a completely different movie, the 1963 Italian swords and shirtlessness fantasy crapster piece, Tar the Mighty. During this footage, we're only treated to the top half of the frame, while badly digitized titles are shown on the blacked out bottom half. Unlike the next experiments from FBI, where the recycled footage used for the credits would get increasingly unrelated and tacky, this actually feels like the proper movie to use to misrepresent cave dwellers. For proof, I decided to look up the synopsis for Tor the Mighty online, and I found this gibberish.
The warlike men of Kixos murder the king of Surupak and abduct his two daughters, Gia and Tuja. Gia's bridegroom, Syros, asks the mighty warrior Taurus for assistance. Taurus's faithful companion, Oraburatura, will give Taurus a hand to defeat the warlike tribe.
It's easy to see why FBI might have believed that these two movies were one and the same, so even though the credit footage was essentially used to get around copyright loopholes and make a profit on movies that the company didn't actually own, I'll chalk this one up to an honest mistake. The episode itself is vintage MST3K. Whether it's Joel and the bots trying to make a more accurate credit sequence, or Joel teaching the bots how to be a Foley artist, there's a warm, relaxed Saturday morning feeling to the proceedings. The stupidity of the movie gives the show one of the most iconic moments and one of the most enduring riffs of its entire history. The most popular occurs when the name of the movie's lead, Miles O'Keefe, appears on screen.
Neat.
How much Keefe is in this movie anyway?
Miles O'Keefe.
The riff is underplayed, almost thrown away, and it sets the tone for the season. I personally prefer the later seasons, where the pacing is tighter and the proceedings more lively, but when choosing to rewatch episodes of the show, I never neglect to go back to Season 3 and watch it in its entirety. You can still feel the show growing, as all the performers were still defining their characters, and the writers still discovering new ways to riff and more dynamic ways to put together the host segments. My favorite aspect of Cave Dwellers comes at the end of the episode, when Crow and Cambot have decided to take the fight to the Mads and call out all the anachronisms and incidents of lazy filmmaking that they can muster in 1 minute.
Okay, look. It's bad enough that this was clearly the worst film you have ever sent us, but it was also filled with continuity problems to boot. My colleague Crow will elucidate.
A what?
You'll show him.
Oh, right, okay. Anyway, frame 122:47. Cambot, bring that up. A pan of a field, yet seen clearly in the back, somebody's been four-wheeling. Okay, next frame, please. 216:25:03. Thank you, Cambot, for giving the fact that Ator is flying a hang glider. He's doing it over a modern city! Okay, now, the piece of resistance. Cambot, 202:043. Okay, during the raping and pillaging, a prehistoric caveman is clearly seen wearing a pair of Ray-Bans. Who's that behind the Foster Grants? It's Og!
Yeah, and what about Scarecrow's brain?
Huh?
What do you want from us? We're evil! Evil!
There's genuine anger in Trace's voice during this little rant, and it gives the impression that, while he's the only one speaking, he's communicating the wrath of the entire writing staff. This marks a turning point for the show. In early seasons, some restraint was used in eviscerating the movie being riffed, like Joel's former stance of having the bots pick something good about the movie to balance their complaints. But from this point on, whatever pain was inflicted on the writers was redirected at the movie in the host segments, so much so that by the end of the season, with the Castle of Fu Manchu, pain became somewhat of a narrative, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself. The actor who plays Ator, Miles O'Keefe, is commonly regarded as a good sport regarding the MST3K treatment of cave dwellers, enjoying it so much that he requested a copy of the tape, and not so he could burn it. What a guy. By the way, if for some reason you're interested in the further adventures of Ator, in 2017 RiffTrax tackled the first movie in the trilogy, Ator the Fighting Eagle, which deals with Ator falling in love with his sister and walking through many a poorly lit set to save her from kidnappers. Some of the footage might look familiar, since Cave Dwellers was made without a completed script and repurposed footage from this movie into flashbacks. It's a movie that makes the sequel look nuanced and professional, and I mean that in the best way. The next movie getting the FBI treatment featured on the show was another foreign knockoff of an American blockbuster, and my favorite episode of the third season, the infamous Pod People. And before you ask, it has nothing to do with pods, it has nothing to do with people, it has everything to do with herding. A French-Spanish co-production, Pod People's original draft was meant to be a horror movie about an evil alien on a murderous rampage, but since it was production in 1982 and shady producers, including the legendary Edward L. Montoro, were clamoring for tacky knockoffs of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, the horror elements were downplayed and scenes were invented that centered around a child and a cute, lovable alien. For some reason, this young male child is dubbed by a middle-aged woman, and the quote-unquote cute, lovable alien is called Trumpy and is basically a more disturbing version of Alf with a long elephant trunk that doubles as a vacuum cleaner at several points during the movie. His eyes also light up and turn the child's bedroom into an acid trip, using what I assume is telekinesis to make chairs and laundry and the game Simon to float about his room while inane, goofy music plays. There's also a band of kids that make terrible music and a few hunters roaming around the French countryside being terrorized by a much larger version of Trumpy, but aside from that terrible music, none of that stuff means anything. The movie's director, Juan Picur Simon, was, according to all online accounts, disappointed by the film's final result. The year before Pod People, Simon directed Pieces, about a murderer on a college campus brutally killing students and using their body parts to make a human jigsaw puzzle. 5 years after Pod People, Simon directed Slugs, where, well, killer slugs do some killing. I've seen both of these movies. You can pity me later. But it's fascinating to know that out of the three, this is the one that disappoints him. For the movie's FBI treatment, the opening and closing credits were stolen from an unrelated and possibly just as terrible movie from 1985 called The Galaxy Invader, where a meteor brings an alien creature that looks like a melting version of Wes Craven's Swamp Thing wearing Oshkosh Bagosh overalls chasing rednecks around the woods. The first time I saw this episode, as delighted with Trumpy as I was severely disappointed that the monster in the credits, who also resembles the Thing from Fantastic Four if all his rocks were substituted with honeycombs, never shows up. Thankfully, the Riff Tracks gang brilliantly riffed Galaxy Invader in 2011, and I was finally able to see the titular Invader. I'm not gonna lie, he has none of Trumpy's charisma, and also, unlike Trumpy, you never see the Invader in a gross embryonic state. Yes, you heard me correctly, Pod People has a gooey Trumpy in it. But, like I said earlier, where Pod People is deficient in the rednecks and meteor monsters category, it excels in the terrible music category. And that terrible music arrives in the introduction for the aforementioned band of kids that are being terrorized by Trumpy 2.0. We meet the band in a recording studio in the midst of making their first single, Burning Rubber Tires.
Hear the death. Flying over trout? Hey, you think the mic's picking up their dancing?
Lyrics by Mrs. Johnson's kindergarten class.
Wind in my eyes?
All victims ready to skull?
This nonsensical song, which it turns out is actually about car racing, is so unintelligible and generic that it made for the ideal material for the MST3K treatment. What made it legendary all comes down to an improper cultural translation. When the quote-unquote artists are quote-unquote singing the quote-unquote song and are finished, the sound engineers ask for the lead quote-unquote singer's opinion, and he makes the OK signal with his hand and declares,
"It stinks."
Wah, wah, wah.
For years, this was considered to be one of the weirdest, most contradictory things to happen in a movie riffed by MST3K, but recent research and Wikipedia searches indicate that in France, where this movie was produced, the gesture signifies, quote, zero or worthless, end quote. More interesting is that in the Middle East and in parts of Brazil and Germany and several South American countries, it can be interpreted as, quote, either an insult, mainly, you are an asshole, the slang for anus itself, or an offensive reference to homosexuality, end quote. Despite this, if you look at the comments section for this episode on Facebook, I guarantee you will see at least one GIF including the gesture and the words, "it stinks." It's entrenched in MST3K lore. But while that's a great moment in the movie, that scene is not what I'm referring to when I say this episode has my favorite moment of the entire series. No, that would be the first host segment, where Joel decides to record Burning Rubber Tires using the lyrics he thinks he heard during the movie, renamed Idiot Control now for reasons you'll soon understand, while Crow, Servo, and Gypsy are all in princess dresses and serving as the backup chorus. Because I love it so, I'm going to play the segment in its entirety. And before I play it, I'll just give you this little tip. If for the next minute and 20 seconds don't make you laugh, just listen for Gypsy singing backup. It might be Jim Mallon's finest moment as a performer. Here we go.
With a pickle mind, we kick the nipple beer. Steady as a goat, we're flying over trout. Ghetto down the highway at the speed of light. All I wanna feel now is the wind in my eyes. Sack of monkeys in my pocket. My sister's ready to go. Hear the engines roll now. Idiot control now. Hideous control now. Nitty on the road now. Idiot control. Wheels on fire. Burning rubber tires. Woo.
He's pretty good.
Good. He's the best.
Leary jelly rolls now. Hit it, Leslie go now. Nitty inches bow down. Pity in a poor boy. Pity inches roll. Bees on pie. Burning rubber tires.
Oh, great. Pretty good. What do you think?
It stinks.
I'm not alone in my love for Pod People, the episode, not the movie, as it was voted the 5th best episode of the series during the 2015 Kickstarter to fund the show's revival. I don't know if I would agree, as there are quite a few episodes from Season 4 and beyond that I enjoy far more and cannot wait to discuss, but this one always hits the sweet spot. And it's one of only 2 episodes of this season that I go back to regularly. It's a perfect example that while Seasons 4 through 6 are probably the pinnacle of the program, they knew what they were doing very early on, a portent of things to come. In fact, it's so enjoyable that I decided to watch an entire television show that I've never had any interest in just so I would understand a recurring reference. For Pod People, that show was McCloud. Because the movie frequently features people walking through misty woodlands looking for other people, this riff is frequently reprised.
Uncle Bill?
Jody?
Buffy?
Mr. French?
Mrs. Beasley?
Chief?
McCloud?
They repeat this riff about 4 or 5 more times before the episode's over, and by the end, I'm laughing at a joke that I didn't even really understand, which is not something that I do. Not only that, my brother, who doesn't care for MST3K, but whom I frequently forced into watching with me, was in stitches. Very odd. All I knew about McCloud beforehand was that it was a television show, and that was merely through cultural osmosis. I've never been tempted to look it up on Wikipedia or even glance at the DVD box at the library, but this time my interest was piqued. But I decided to go into the show cold. No pre-screening, no internet searches, just sitting down with the program and taking it in. Before I give my assessment, I want to address my research process really quickly. Throughout my rewatching of the entire series, references or parodies have inspired me to watch many a movie and many a television show, and I take copious notes because my ability to remember things without assistance can be difficult sometimes. For the most part, the movies have been fantastic. The television shows, however, have not been ideal. If you decide to listen to my chapter on Season 4, you'll get a great example of exactly how low television can go. McCloud was the 3rd show that I watched for this podcast, and the first 2 felt like bad omens. So I wasn't looking forward to watching McCloud, not a single bit. But I sucked it up, broke out my Apple TV, and clicked on the show. Before the episode began, I checked the runtime, which I always do when I'm nervous that I'm about to waste my time. 98 minutes, 9 seconds. This wasn't looking good. Then I pressed play. The first shots were of a Jeep driving through the desert, and once the driver had exited the car and was revealed to be Dennis Weaver, I had made up my mind. I was going to enjoy this. The 98 minutes flew by, and so I watched the next episode. Soon, I had watched the entire first season, then the second. It's not what I would call a great show, but with Dennis Weaver, it has a great star who is serviced by a great character. In many ways, it's a standard 70s cop drama, which is a genre that I particularly loathe, but any time the show focuses on its protagonist, Sam McCloud, and Weaver plays him like a redneck Columbo, it's gold. Even when everyone else in the scene is hokey or the mysteries he has to solve are uninteresting, Weaver is never less than incredibly likable and compelling. It's the kind of show that I will never request to watch, but if I'm going into a depression spiral or having a day where I'm exceptionally bipolar, I'll take a sativa gummy, pop on McCloud, and try to relax. So what exactly is McCloud about? The series follows the aforementioned Sam McCloud, a deputy marshal in Taos, New Mexico, who, because of a series of typical cop drama plot machinations, ends up on loan to the NYPD. His chief barely tolerates him, and he always manages to solve the convoluted case by relying on his instincts. He also has an almost supernatural ability to woo any woman on the face of the earth, even though Dennis Weaver looks and acts like a grandfather, and he was almost pushing 50 at the time. You would think that the show would be part of the fish-out-of-water genre, but Sam McCloud is no boob. I know I described him earlier as a redneck Columbo, but I didn't mean that as an insult. He's folksy and optimistic, but an amazing cop with thick skin, so it's not like the urban jungle of New York is an obstacle for him. He doesn't have to get used to living in a new environment with new customs because he gets people in general. He's not looking at a car and asking about these newfangled horseless carriages. This isn't fucking Crocodile Dundee from the South. And that's a very welcome change of pace considering the direction that virtually every other show of its kind has taken. The only real drawback to watching as much of the show as I did in such a short amount of time is that I was waiting for the Pod People riff in every line of dialogue in every episode, and it didn't arrive until towards the end of the run of the episodes that were available. That's a long wait for one brief reference, but if Dennis Weaver wasn't so goddamn awesome, it would have felt like punishment. I hope for it in the pilot, but in that episode, the Chief was played by the decidedly less surly Peter Mark Richmond, who was then replaced by the amazing J.D. Cannon in the first official episode. But the entire first season passed by with just a few teases of the reference, but never the reference whole. When the first reference finally came up in Season 2, I was elated. I was like a larger, sadder Indiana Jones, and I had just discovered something that belonged in a museum. Here it is from Episode 4 of the second season.
Yes, I'm holding.
My big problem is you can't track down something if you don't know what to look for. I just wish I had some clue as to how this killer will operate. You know, Chief, I've been thinking.
Stop calling me Chief. You make me feel like a Comanche.
Back where I come from, the best man to track down a cattle rustler is a man who rustles cattle himself. You know some of our best lawmen used to be outlaws?
Well, that's a fascinating bit of Americana, but what are you leading up to? Yes, I'm still holding.
Well, I just thought if I could talk to a professional killer, I might get a better idea of how to spot this man. At least I might learn something about what goes on inside him.
Consult a professional killer. I see. And just how do you propose to do that? Run an ad? Yes, I'm still holding.
Oh, I thought maybe you might know one.
McCloud, we of the New York Police Department are broad-minded. We are flexible. We even tolerate you. But we are not going into consultation with murderers. Now just look after Yerby and try not to get any more ideas. Hello? Yes? Oh, good morning, Mr. Mayor. No, I didn't mind holding. No, not at all.
It's basically the entire show in a nutshell, and I never would have seen it if it were not for MST3K. I am so damn grateful. I do have one large problem, though, and it's directed at Universal Home Video. The first season that I watched was only 3 episodes, but 6 were broadcast, and the 3 that I watched seemed definitely hastily thrown together. By following the synopses online, I definitely saw parts of all 6 episodes. Was I going mad? No. Universal just screwed the pooch. The following is from Wikipedia.
DVDs for Season 1, as released by Universal, were not the original episodes, but conflated TV movie recreations by Universal producer Harry Tattleman and editor Jean-Jacques Berthelot to extract additional revenues from a series considered too short of episodes to produce useful syndicated material. By editing together pieces from multiple episodes in Season 1, it made it appear that McCloud solves 2 mysteries in each quote-unquote movie. Subplots and some characters were edited out. This process was made easier by the fact that McCloud's uniform remained the same in each episode. The results were disjointed enough that at least one original writer, Douglas Hayes, required his name being changed in the credits to a pseudonym. These hybrid episodes were at one time considered all that was left of the original 6 programs of Season 1. The originals, located after a diligent search by the Australian independent label Madman Entertainment, were found in good condition stored in a vault at a station in London. It is unknown if the remaining seasons will be released in the US at some point.
Get your shit together, Universal. Put together some of that ill-gotten minion money and give McCloud the justice it deserves, even if you're only holding back because the unreleased episodes are terrible. But then again, given the bulk of your catalog, God knows that's never stopped you before from releasing something. And before this chapter concludes, I'm going to do something I've wanted to do since I first saw Pod People. You ready? Chief?
McCloud.
The next episode to feature an FBI production was a substantially less, substantial, Stranded in Space, which was actually the first made-for-TV work to be riffed on the show, and was actually a repackaged failed pilot for a series and aired as the 5th experiment of the season. Its plot concerns an astronaut whose space mission crashes on an undiscovered twin planet of Earth, hidden on our far side of the sun. This world is identical to ours, except it's subjugated by a system of government that pays homage to Orwell's 1984 if homage were redefined as ripoff. The astronaut is then forced to find various ways off this wretched planet and back to his own, only to fail time and time again. The sad thing about Stranded in Space, or rather The Stranger, its original title, is that I think, given better production values, better writers, and slightly better performers, it could have been a great maxi series like The Prisoner. Actually, if you were to modernize it, condense it, and save the twist for the end of the story, it could make for a decent hour of Black Mirror. But here, it's largely forgettable and borrows much from The Fugitive, but not the good parts of The Fugitive, and also features Cameron Mitchell. All 3 of those issues are clear red flags. For the FBI treatment, the opening and closing credits are stolen from the 1983 South African tax shelter sci-fi movie Prisoners of the Lost Universe, which was covered by Riff Tracks in 2012. I think I'm noticing a pattern here. Unfortunately, that movie has the honorable distinction of having John Saxon, the only man who can play believable good guys and believable creeps with the exact same delivery, but Mr. Saxon is excluded from the clips. I would swap out Cameron Mitchell for John Saxon in a heartbeat, not just in this episode, but in life in general. But John Saxon will return to the show with a vengeance in Mitchell, so stay tuned. As for the episode itself, it's a standard Season 3 affair, low-key and cute, but it does include a change to the show's mythology in its opening seconds. It turns out, according to Joel's introduction, that the Mads made the nifty opening titles. This is strange considering that Joel sings the theme, but why would you take part in what is essentially his own home video ransom note? But I guess I should really just relax. He also mentions that we, the viewer, only get his broadcast because the Mads also sell the results of each week's experiment to cable television. This throwaway plot device actually becomes a major subplot in the 2017 revival season, but again, we'll get to that much later. The last 2 quote-unquote movies to receive the FBI treatment in Season 3 were repackaged episodes of the 1984 NBC drama The Master, about an aging ninja master played by an aged Lee Van Cleef, and his young dimwit ward played by Dame Timothy Van Patten. Most episodes focus on the wacky mismatched pair driving around in a custom van, helping out people in need along the way, similar to a well-known contemporary like the A-Team, with a senior citizen and a man-child. Sounds like something worth watching for 2 hours, right? Well, FBI thought so, releasing several episodes patched together under the titles Master Ninja 1 and Master Ninja 2, which closed out the season. According to the internet, there's also a Master Ninja 3 that was initially considered to be the 6th season finale, but it was changed for reasons that we will discuss eventually. These episodes are pretty bad. Even if you never knew that this show existed, it's clear in viewing these quote-unquote movie versions that you're watching mediocre television. Van Cleef is completely checked out, and Van Patten is at his most Van Patten-y. Joel even jokes at one point that Van Cleef looks like the Splinter prosthetic suit from the first Ninja Turtles movie. Well, he actually says one of Henson's rats, but I gave the respectful version. But the more I look at him, the more I see it. It's also worth noting that as I began my research on this chapter, the series was released unedited on Blu-ray by Kino Lorber. Amazing Stories only has one season on DVD. 90% of the best Adult Swim shows are not available on any physical format. The Muppet Show is owned by Disney, Lord Emperor of corporations, and still has 2 seasons unreleased. But The Master is available in its entirety on the best home video format of this time. It feels unjust. Since I was crazy mad about this release, I went to my local library and picked up a copy to see just how bad the show was. I've seen the first 6 episodes, and I can tell you now from experience that FBI did not do much editing to make these things bad. This is a generic 80s high-concept action procedural. I do an entire segment on the episodes, but I didn't take notes because I was so goddamn angry. Also, they were on in the background as I was writing future chapters of this podcast, so maybe I probably don't have much to say either way. On the bright side, Fraggle Rock should be in high def by the time this chapter airs, and that's a good thing, I guess. The MST3K episodes, however, do not disappoint. There's Crow attempting to do George C. Scott's monologue from Patton as Timothy Van Patten, Naked Lunch adapted into a pop-up book, and Frank and Forrester inventing a disturbing Lucy sketch, and it's all pretty sweet, especially considering that as the 22nd and 24th and final experiments of the season, the cast and crew were clearly burnt out. But there are 2 things worth replaying for you lucky listeners, 1 clip per episode. First, there's the now immortal Master Ninja theme song, which rivals Pod People for sheer earworm value. Here's a taste.
Come on. Let me throw in a little wall.
Gypsy. Okay. That sounds good, okay. Master Ninja theme song. Okay, now. Put that up on Still Store, will you? Master Ninja theme song. Okay. We, the officers of the Battleship Missouri, wish to congratulate you on the quality programming you are injecting in the Master Ninja theme song, fiber optic veins of our nation. While in the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Storm, we often felt as you must. Master Ninja theme song, trapped in a steel box with little or no contact with the outside world, yet engaged in important and dangerous work. Master Ninja theme song. Ow! As comrades, we salute you. We spend many off-hour duty hours enjoying your show. To help repay you for the pleasure given us, Master Ninja theme song. We would like to do something for you. Some of us are engineering by profession and would like to offer our assistance in designing, manufacturing, service arms. Master Ninja theme song, your torso. Let us know if you want any special features such as death lasers or detachable radio control fingers. We eagerly await your plot. Master Ninja theme song. What do you think, sir?
I had seen bits and pieces of the MST3K Master Ninja saga in my younger years, and never put together that they were all hour-long episodes of television, with the ad breaks removed, and bad ADR to splice them thematically. But in case you watch these experiments and are convinced that they are in fact movies, Frank kinda breaks the illusion towards the end of the experiment.
Doctor, can I just say something? Can I just get serious? I have something very important, which I really feel has to be said.
Well, Frank, you do look serious. By all means, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Doctor. You know, one thing in today's experiment caused great pain to yours truly, TV's Frank. It was the appearance of Monty Markham in the second episode, the later half of today's movie.
The FBI treatment is more than just sloppy editing and bad ADR, though. Both Master Ninja movies contain an opening and closing credit sequence that I can't describe better than this assessment from the MST3K wiki page. Both films use an orange background, behind which inverted color footage of unidentified martial arts practice can be seen through a moving circular opening. The footage does not come from any film, but rather appears to come from an amateur recording filmed at a martial arts training center. Yeah, that's the FBI way. Can't think of a movie to chop up and use for a credit sequence? Just film somebody doing strip mall judo with a camcorder on thermal mode. Classy. The sad part is, the real opening credits for the Master TV show were actually pretty great, in an ironic way. as crucial as Film Ventures International and its despicable practices were to MST3K's third season, another mysterious film distributor played a bigger role, responsible for 9 episodes in total. This distributor specialized in Japanese imports of a questionable nature, and his name was Frank, Sandy Frank. Doing a 24-episode season was a daunting new reality to the cast and crew of MST3K. They would be afforded slightly more production time with the expectation of 11 extra episodes to screen, license, and complete, so the crew relied on an old adage to move more briskly: go with what you know. The crew realized that, in their struggle to find films to license, a package of 9 movies from Sandy Frank, including 5 Gamera movies and 4 other movies comprised of re-edited Japanese television series, was still available. It was the very same package that KTMA owned when the first unofficial season of the show was airing, and since they had already riffed them before, they already knew what worked and what they knew, with hindsight, what could have been done better. Sandy Frank was known for 2 things: producing and then syndicating crappy game shows, and Lassie, and buying the distribution rights to Japanese monster movies and television shows, and then re-editing, redubbing, and repackaging them. But he didn't go for the big guns. He went for the more affordable guns. When you can't get Godzilla, you get the next best thing: Mothra. When you can't get Mothra, you get Gamera.
Here he comes, the hot new star who's taking Tinseltown by storm. And no one's going to get in the way of this ambitious amphibian as he delivers his most electrifying performance ever.
There's just a chance it might work.
Gamera, the terrifying turtle that set Tokyo on fire, explodes on the home video marketplace, and the critics love him.
It looks like it's a kind of a sea creature or monster.
Gamera, the towering inferno who'll change your feelings about pet turtles forever. This versatile star leaves audiences spellbound as he plays a fire-breathing dragon one moment and a flying saucer the next.
We see terrible things if we live too long.
Get ready for lights, action, Gamera.
Gamera is a turtle of many colors. Like Godzilla, Gamera was also born of the Atomic Age, although where Godzilla was a lizard that was embiggened by radiation, Gamera was a prehistoric creature laying dormant in the Arctic that was simply woken up by an A-bomb. Like Godzilla, Gamera can also breathe fire, but unlike Godzilla, he can also retract his head and limbs into his shell and activate rocket boosters in his butt that send him spinning through space. Gamera is best remembered as Friend to All Children, a label that is made evident by the fact that kids are often the annoying protagonists in many of his screen epics, and he manages to coincidentally save them after they're subjected to various traumas, including, in one case, aliens that abduct 2 children and shave their heads in preparation for eating their brains. But Gamera almost never existed. The director of the first in the series initially began production on a film called The Great Rat Swarm, which would involve real rats crawling over miniatures of cities. The rats received for the film had fleas, which halted production, so the producer decided to simply make a Godzilla movie with a giant turtle instead. Thus was born 1965's Gamera the Giant Monster, which still serves as one of the most literal titles in film history. Like the original 1954 Godzilla, the first Gamera movie is in black and white, albeit not artfully, and featured the giant turtle destroying scale models of Japan that weren't still infested with fleas. Unlike future movies, he serves as an antagonist of the movie and has no monster nemesis to fight. The only portent of movies to come is the appearance of Kenny, a small child that comes to Gamera's defense when he's imprisoned in a giant rocket and launched into Mars. This is naturally just a temporary setback, as Gamera is freed from his rocket by a stray meteor and returns a year later in Gamera vs. Barugon. The titular enemy is a lizard dog monster that is rampaging Japan with its battering ram tongue, frozen liquid nitrogen spit, and deathly energy ray. Meanwhile, there's a subplot about a deceptive treasure hunter who allows his compatriots to die so he can obtain a large opal from a primitive island, but it's really not important. Another year later, the franchise churned out what is arguably its third movie, Gamera vs. Gauss, Dawn of Justice. In it, a volcanic eruption awakens a huge triangle-headed vampire bat monster named Gauss, who has an ultrasonic yellow beam with laser-like cutting power that emits from his mouth. While there are no children for Gamera to befriend last time, this new adventure brings portly young Itchy to cheer him on, and otherwise have no bearing on the plot whatsoever. Also, because I find it humorous, I will read the only anecdote about the movie I could find on its wiki page.
This is the first film in which Gamera bleeds.
It is indeed, folks. It is indeed. 2 years after that, Gamera returns to battle Gurion, a creature that resembles a fat porcupine with a head shaped like a Ginsu knife, and ninja stars that are periodically released from its nasal passages. Gurion is truly one of the stupidest things I've seen in 32 years of life, and perhaps that's why I love him so much. And remember when I mentioned the kids that had their heads shaved by aliens in preparation for brain feasting? That's here too. Gamera vs. Gurion is truly an embarrassment of riches. It's truly hard to dislike a movie that features Space Gauss, who's actually just regular Gauss, spray-painted silver, shooting a laser beam at Gurion, whose tempered blade head reflects the beam back at Space Gauss and amputates his arm in the process. The fifth and final Gamera movie to be featured on MST3K featured a battle with Zigra, an extraterrestrial goblin shark that holds dominion over another planet. The movie's inventive title, Gamera vs. Zigra. I've seen this episode about 3 times and remember almost nothing about the movie itself. And you know what? I'm okay with that. And you should be too. The Gamera series as a whole represents the perfect material for a show like MST3K. Due to language and cultural barriers, there's a disconnect that is inherently funny. The quality of the scripts also doesn't help. Even the greatest dialogue in the world comes off as terrible when given the delivery of a Sandy Frank dubbing. Here's a quote from Pulp Fiction as told by one of the voice actors from Sandy Frank Productions.
There is a passage I got memorized. Ezekiel 25:17. The path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who, in the name of charity and goodwill, shepherds the weak through the valley of the darkness, for he is truly his brother's keeper and the finder of lost children. I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger those who attempt to poison and destroy my brothers. And you will know I am the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon you.
That was beautiful. Special thanks to Sandy Frank for the access to such wonderful vocal talent. I'm not really familiar with that actor, but they have real range, and they work for scale. The effects also look atrocious, even though you can tell that people put some real effort into some of them. The editing and storytelling are choppy at best, and the content of the films are produced for such a specific yet seemingly generic demographic that aspects of its appeal will remain eternally baffling. Because of all these constants in the Gamera series, and the way that they're spread about the season, it makes Season 3 feel like sort of a homecoming. The cast and crew are older and wiser, tackling familiar foes, with still more growing to do. The Gamera episodes themselves are similarly terrific. In the first episode, which aired as the second experiment of the season, Servo sings a ballad to his pet turtle Tibby, until Crow shows up and decides to be a bad brother.
Oh, Tibby, he runs like the wind, a couple of inches, and then back again.
May I take a verse?
Well, if you feel it, Crow.
Oh, I do.
Well, Crow, then by all means, join me, won't you?
5, 6, 7, 8. Tippy!
It's Tibby! Tibby!
Sorry. I love you, my fine little fella, even though you gave the whole family salmonella.
No, it's not their fault. It isn't their fault. Crow, you take everything good and you rip my heart out.
Jeez, I'm sorry.
Come on, Crow, let him finish his song.
Oh, okay.
Go
Just
ahead,
a stupid old turtle.
Go ahead, Tom.
Gamera vs. Baragon aired as Experiment 4 and features 3 moments particularly worth revisiting, like Joel and the bots lounging in beach chairs on the bridge, which leads to one of the most genuinely sweet outtakes ever. If you have a copy of the MST3K blooper reel, Poopy, there's a take of Trace losing control of Crow's verticality due to his being positioned as if he's sitting on the floor, and the rest of the cast roll with it in character.
Boy, it sure is nice today,
Yeah, it is. Just like a warm summer.
Wait. Crow passed out. He's got sunstroke. Talk to me, boy.
What's wrong, Crow?
Help me!
There's something so warm and paternal about Joel's response that really sticks out as something special, and it was one of the greatest things about his time on the show. But back to the actual episode, there's also the hilarious fake commercial for the Fighting Men and Monster set, which is essentially 2 minutes of still frames of Joel, Servo, and Crow playing with green army men and giant toy lizards on a play battlefield. Kevin narrates the entire piece with the breathless verve of the guy who sold Micro Machines.
Kids, here's the greatest, the neatest, the latest thing. 5,000-piece Fightin' Men and Monster set, some pieces not included. Astonish and baffle your friends and foes while you pulverize Japan. Here's what you get. 500 Japanese light infantry body parts may not be missing. 36 helpless officials, 20 tanks, 15 recoilless rifles not in the set. 24 bazooka gun runners, 18 ambulance chasers, 12 jet fighters, 6 not included. 16 helicopter parts, 200 shooting crouchers, 19 fighting clowns, 8 deserters, 6 Kisaleyan, 24 Mohawk Indians, and much, 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 much more. Act now and receive at half the extra value of the mystifying monster action pack. Flame on with Gamera, torso sold separately. He spits real fire and causes real pain. Solid rubber bear gun comes complete with optional ram tongue action, not responsible for nerve damage. And amuse your friends with Topol, Neepsong, and Bart the Battling Belgian Endive. Some parts may not exist. Act now, act often, and snap on the entire Tokyo metropolitan area, complete with buildings, bridges, and the breakaway Monty Nuko Dam, smaller than shown. Trample the add-on hapless citizen playset, then abhor the action with the fabulous anti-war protest pack. Senator Wellstone not included. But that's not all. Relive your favorite Japanese movie carnage with the Lights Gamera Action Series. There's the Gimp, the Goon, the Shamefilled Brother, the Hapless Keisha, and the pull-apart Voodoo Kenny. Pose in the nude with the Frisky Kitten review, then watch the action from high atop Tokyo Tower as the twisted world you create explodes in rivers of blood and endless pain. Order today. Offer limited. Not available in Utah or Puerto Rico. Prices subject to whim. Please wear rubber underwear and some parts may be made of chicken. Neck now. Buy bonds. A dog. Mommy. Mommy. Mommy.
Okay, breathe, boy, breathe. That was a good one. Let's not do that again.
And he did it all in one take. Kevin has some mighty strong lungs. But for myself, and I understand that most of you couldn't give a shit about this episode contains a line rating from Trace as Dr. Forrester that I love so much I'll eventually try to use it at a family reunion.
This goes back, Frogbait, and so am I.
Clearly I have a lot of issues. Gamera vs. Gauss, Dawn of Justice aired as the 8th experiment of the season. It's notable mainly for a segment that plays out like a classic vaudeville ventriloquist act. Joel tries to instruct the viewer at home how to make a homemade paper Gauss, while Crow and Servo sabotage his presentation by telling children about dangerous, imitatable alternatives.
Anyway, what you do is you just take the 4 corners and you fold them in just like that. It's simple.
Oh,
Okay.
Now while he's doing that, you might want to run down to the public library and cut out some interesting pictures from the encyclopedia to paste on your project.
Yeah, and in case you're interested, mucilage tastes just like sweet honey.
You guys, please do not, I repeat, do not go down to the public library and do not cut pictures out of the encyclopedia and do not drink mucilage, for it does not taste like sweet honey, from one who knows.
Gamera vs. Gurion, again, the best of the bunch, aired as Experiment 12 and features the first use of Gamera's theme song.
Hey, Snappy.
Sounds like the Vienna Boys Choir sings songs of Gamera.
It's the cast of Oliver, I think. Senorita Gamera?
Senorita Gamera.
Oh.
This naturally leads Joel and the bots to come up with their own cover version.
Gamera! Gamera! Gamera is really neat. Gamera is filled with meat. We've been eating Gamera. Shell, teeth, eyes, flames, claws, breath, scales, fun.
Dr. Forrester is kind of a jerk, and Frank is really dumb too.
We have to take part in these lame experiments.
But do we complain?
No.
No.
Yes.
Huh? So we keep all over the place.
And talk of 1,000 wonderful days.
Everybody now.
Gamera is really sweet. He is filled with turtle meat. Now we have commercial sign.
The song feels like it was written in about 5 minutes, which seems appropriate, and if you watch just the last 2 Gamera-centric episodes, you'll hear it another 4 or 5 times. The final nail in Gamera's coffin, Gamera vs. Zigra, aired as the 16th experiment of the season. It's worth watching for numerous reasons, but I'm just going to give you one. Having heard ahead of time that this experiment would be the last for Gamera, Joel decides to have an impromptu root beer kegger in honor of this milestone, and Magic Voice has a bit too much to drink.
Looks like the keg's fried.
Oh, bummer!
Wow, this is far from industrial, man.
Well, listen, you guys, there's a lot you can do even when the keg has run out. Now, we got, pin the flames on Gamera, and we got this Gamera pinata. There's just a lot of stuff you can do.
Everybody quiet. I just want to say that Joel Robinson is one fine human being. Commercial sign now.
Enough for you.
And that's where we have to pause for today. Why? I want to keep this podcast as close to the hour mark as possible. We'll pick up right where we left off this time next week as we continue this chapter of the Coolness Chronicles on the history and legacy of MST3K. But the show's not over yet, folks. Sorry. Every hour of this fine podcast concludes with a segment called Random Recommendations. This week's recommendation comes from one of my very best friends, Brittany Duncan. Because she and her family, as well as several of my other friends, live 2 hours away, I only get to see them once a month at best, so I try to make the most of my visits. When we first met, Brittany asked me if I'd ever seen 1985's Real Genius. When I confessed that I had not, she insisted that the next time I visit, we watch it. Sure enough, I visited a month later and we watched Real Genius, which I believe was streaming on Amazon at the time. I could not have been more pleasantly surprised.
Number 3 goes on one knee for a token. Number 4 is the short straw, but it's broken. I'd give my all just to be number 1.
It boasts a screenplay co-written by Pat Proft, who would go on to collaborate on some great movies with Zaz, Zucker Abrams Zucker, the subject of Season 2 of this podcast, and was directed by the criminally underrated Martha Coolidge, who turned in another great 80s effort, Valley Girl, 2 years earlier. It stars Val Kilmer in his second film role after Top Secret, the year previous, another Zaz connection, and features William Atherton from Ghostbusters and Die Hard delivering a villain performance that I would argue eclipses his work on both of those films. I know that's heresy, but there's something truly special about this film. The dialogue is snappy and clever, and the aesthetic totally typifies and exemplifies the best of 80s comedies without falling prey to the trappings of the genre. Usually, even if I enjoy one of these movies, I will still dislike the characters and general tone of the piece. In Real Genius, the characters are engaging and actually worth emotionally investing in. When the good guys lose or are set back in some way, I'm rooting for them 100%, which is something that usually leaves me cold when it comes to other comedies of the era. That's probably because there are actual emotional stakes here. When there's a musical montage of Kilmer's character cramming for a pivotal exam, the montage is used to actually enrich the character and to get the viewer to comprehend the pressure that he's under. It frequently takes common tropes like this, but uses them in ways that aren't played for traditional laughs. But when it flips the switch into truly being funny, it does not disappoint. And what other film could offer you dialogue like this?
No, seriously, listen, if there's ever anything I can do for you, or more to the point, to you, you let me know, okay?
Can you hammer a 6-inch spike through a board with your penis?
Not right now.
A girl's gotta have her standards.
In any other 80s movie, a guy acting like that would come across as scuzzy or sexist. But when the lines are delivered with genuine innocence and the woman gets the punchline, it's just wonderful alchemy. If you haven't seen Real Genius yet, don't wait any longer. It lives up to its title, and then some. Please send me your random recommendations on Twitter, Facebook, or email, and make sure to explain why you endorse it. I didn't ask that at first, and it actually made research more difficult. Before I conclude, I wanted to thank everyone involved in making MST3K for everything they've contributed to my life and culture as a whole. Double thanks for also writing the episode guide that I will quote frequently in this season of the pod. And I also want to thank Shout Factory for their excellent supplemental material that was invaluable to my research for this and every episode to follow on this subject. You can get the show on DVD at Amazon.com, but if you want to support the artists who made this wonderful show, many episodes are available on VOD on RiffTrax.com. I'm not affiliated with any of these organizations, I just work here. Thanks for listening. Please rate and review the show on iTunes or your chosen source. If you enjoy the program, share it with someone else. This is the best and largest endeavor I've seen to completion, and it would be nice to keep making the show until it just isn't fun anymore. Links to all subjects discussed on the pod can be found on our website at www.coolnesschronicles.com. There you can email your questions, comments, or random recommendations. You can also contact me on Twitter at CoolnessPodRyan, or like our Facebook page and watch for updates. Have suggestions for future seasons, as this series is not exclusively about MST3K, it's just a natural first topic, or things to discuss that are MST3K related, send them on over. If you want to advertise in this program, I'm a total sucker for a sponsor, so I'll pimp out any product you have. And our next chapter will be posted soon. Until then, do what you love, don't be a dick, and as always...
People always ask me how I pronounce my name, Goldblum or Goldblum. I always tell them the same thing. How dare you speak to me?
I mean, goodbye, for now.